Welcome, everyone, to Misconceptions. I am excited to welcome you today to meet a friend that really we go back quite a number of years, a colleague and friend. Welcome, Maya Grobel.
Hi there. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for saying yes. We recently saw each other at a conference at the Jefferson Conference, now called the Jones Infertility Conference. Just happens to be lucky me here in Philly. It's a conference for mental health professionals and infertility. So, talk to me. Introduce yourself, please. Let the world know who is Maya Grobel.
Oh, well, the world must know. So I am a licensed clinical social worker like you, and was Los Angeles based for a long time. Now I'm living up in the Pacific Northwest, but my focus in my practice has been assisted reproduction, infertility, fertility, alternative family building, all of those lovely and very life-changing things for a lot of people. So I've been doing this work for about 10 years as a psychotherapist. And my own journey to parenthood led me to shifting my career, which I think happens for a lot of people. But I had an almost 5-year journey to parenthood that started with a diagnosis of diminished ovarian reserve and then IVF, which was not successful. I never say failed. I'm very conscious about language. I say it wasn't
Yes.
successful. I did not fail anything. Let me tell you, I tried my hardest, but I did not have the result that we were hoping for. And my sister actually donated eggs to us at one point in the journey, and that was also not successful. She went on to have children of her own. So, it just sometimes things pan out in interesting ways. But ultimately, my journey ended and my parenting journey began with embryo donation. And I have a now 9-year-old daughter through embryo donation. And how we met originally, Dvora, was through, I documented my journey. My husband and I made a film called One More Shot that was on Netflix for a little bit of time in, I think, 2018 for about 2 years. Gosh, time just goes, doesn't it?
It's amazing. It's amazing. Yeah.
And now the film's on Amazon Prime, but we documented our journey and we shared that because we felt like it was a really important story to tell. I didn't realize that how unique embryo donation was as a family building choice. And I really didn't know much about embryo donation until after I had this baby that I was very fortunate to have, but then was really faced with like, what does this mean? And who are her genetic connections? And how do I make sense of all of this? And so I started to dive, as a social worker and a therapist, these are the questions that feel really important. As a
Sure.
fertility patient, what felt important was resolving my family building crisis. I needed something to be put in that would come out and be alive, and that was as
Sure.
far as I could see. And it's quite the struggle, as many of your listeners probably know, or can relate to. But I ended up really exploring embryo donation and met two women who are now my partners in my latest endeavor. And Gina Davis is one of them. She's a genetic counselor, and Jen Vesbit is another, my other partner. She's a nationally certified counselor, and both of them were IVF warriors like myself, but they fell on the other side of the coin, and they ended up having more embryos than they needed for their family building and ended up being embryo donors themselves. So they donated their embryos to people in a directed way, which at the time, and this is, more than 5, 6 years ago, most of how embryo donation was facilitated was in an anonymous way. It's still done that way, but they both went on their own path. Their clinic didn't provide them much guidance. They just said, "Oh, you can give them to us, and we'll give them to whoever." And they went, "Wait a minute, what do you mean? Just these are our full genetic siblings to our children, right?" They had
Right.
connections to these embryos, and so they matched on their own. They found their own recipients, and it was successful. But the three of us met in 2019, early 2019, and just had this really interesting, we're all personally and professionally connected to embryo donation. And we just thought there's got to be a better way and a different way to do this. People don't know about embryo donation as a family building choice. I didn't until I got there and I went, what? Like, this
Right.
is an
Right.
option. And
Right.
so we created Empower with Moxie, which is an organization dedicated specifically to all things embryo donation, really. We started with education because more than anything, we wanted to educate people on what is this as a disposition option for remaining embryos, and what does this mean for family building? And how do you explore this? How do you find an embryo donor? Or, what am I looking for? And how do I make sense? And what are the best practices for children connected in this way? So
Right.
we created this organization. We actually got some grant funding from the Health and Human Services Department. And we started with education and support. We wanted to do support groups, virtual events, webinars. So we did all of that. And then more and more people kept coming to us saying, can you help us find, a recipient, or can you help us find an embryo donor or donors? And, and then we ended up, kind of long story short, is creating a matching platform called Moxie
Hmm.
Matching, where people can build a profile on both sides, and then we help facilitate an early connection to see if it's a fit, and then we help manage all of the logistics. So we do journey management. We're working with a bunch of clinics, and it's really been amazing to see unfold.
Sure. Sure.
So anyways, that's a
Okay,
long
so
introduction.
that's like
So
a
anyway,
massive like data dump of information. I'm like,
I know.
wait, I have so many questions. Okay, let's
Sorry.
back this up a minute. So first and foremost, I want you to know the film is amazing. So if you haven't seen One More Shot, find it wherever it's available for you. Please go
It's
watch it.
Amazon. It's on Amazon
Amazon
Prime
Prime.
and Vimeo on demand.
Okay. Okay. So I will tell you that I use a clip of that. I've used it a couple of times. One little clip where in teaching about infertility and sensitivity, there is a clip where you are awaiting a phone call to find out if it, I think is if to find out if you were pregnant, and they called you and the nurse goes, I'm sorry, we don't have good news. And it was not successful. And it was such an overwhelming thing to watch you and your husband go through. And then the nurse says, okay, so like have a great weekend. That was the line. Like that, which section I'm talking about, right? And it was such a startling, and everybody who watches that moment of the clip goes, "Oh, ouch." Like that is not okay. And the movie as you portray, the movie that you put out there, it's a documentary, it's full of humor, it's full of tremendous sadness and kind of the step by step experience of somebody who experiences infertility, and it is done with a lot of joy and humor. And I think the other piece of it is the extraordinary relationship that you and your husband show the world, and that was really very very unique and special for us to see. um it's amazing to hear the aftermath of like what comes next, because that's not in the film. There's no like, well, let me show you the follow-up of what did this wonderful couple do next. Let's break I want to ask you, when you look back at that time, first of all, have you rewatched that movie in the last few years?
I did. I did with my daughter actually not too long ago.
Wow.
She says she calls it her movie. She goes, "Let's
Oh.
can you watch my movie?" And um yeah, I don't watch it much. It's really hard. Like these are well, it's very vulnerable. I'm not an actress. I have no intention of being that. I mean, it's quite unflattering for like 97% of the film, but I felt like it was really honest, and I
Very.
didn't see a lot. This is on, remember, this is before like we started filming in like 2012 or something. So this is pre-Instagram. This is before any social media like in this way. Like I think there's so much more of a community now, and there've been, people really working towards getting stories shared, but I didn't see anything that
No.
like what we were going through. We were fairly young. I was in my early 30s at the time. I didn't know what infertility was. Like I didn't know what any of this stuff was. And so it was a really yeah, it was just a really different experience. So I have watched it back, not in full really, but like when I watched with my daughter, it's such a different thing to be able to have retrospect. And this, right? It's like when you can look back in the moment. I mean, I was depressed. I was in a dark place. I was scrambling to figure out how I was going to have a family, and and it's expensive, and it's challenging in so many ways. And watching it back, I realized these were all the pieces that it had to play out like this for us to end up with this child.
Yeah.
She was frozen. It sounds terrible to say it like that, but the embryo that is her was frozen the same year we started trying.
Oh, wow.
She was
Oh,
there for
wow.
5 years as we
Wow.
went through this whole process, right?
Mm.
But I work with a lot of people who go, well, I wish we would have done this. And it's like, you can't go backwards because sometimes it has to play out in this specific way in order to get you to where you need to be in some weird way, so anyway.
Does it, I don't think most of us have the opportunity to see it playing out in literal time, on a movie. So what we're left with is memory. Does it touch you in a different way emotionally to see yourself in those really dark places? Like, I'm just wondering what it's like for you as the star of the show to look back at that moment and seeing yourself in that lived experience.
I think, and you do a lot of trauma work, right? Like that's,
Sure.
um, I think I was very traumatized.
Hmm.
And I think that impacts memory,
Mm.
especially around giving birth, because I had a very traumatic delivery. And this is kind of jumping ahead a little bit in different ways, but like I did transfer another embryo, was not successful. I got pregnant naturally and lost at 10 weeks.
Mm.
So, other things have happened since we had her, but when I did the other transfers and was pregnant, I went back and watched just the footage of the delivery, and I had no memory at
Wow.
all. It was one of those things where I'm watching this other person. I remember like these little moments of, having to pee or, just like little kind of things, but and I think some of the dark infertility years it got like my memory got changed a little bit.
Sure.
So I have a lot of documentation so I can go back and I remember very specific moments, but it feels like a whole other life
Right.
and a whole
Right.
other experience, which I think you
Right.
can, you probably
Yeah.
know.
Well, I mean, just thinking about that idea of like, memory can also be protective, meaning that lack of memory can be a little bit protective and that I don't have to relive it all the time. And yet having video footage of it actually kind of allows you to. I wonder about what that's like emotionally for you to experience
Yeah,
something like that. It's
it's kind of
interesting.
yeah, it's a strange experience in some ways. I think I'm removed enough and my life is so different. I think when you don't know what your outcome is, and I think this is
Right.
one of the hardest thing for a lot of my clients, right? It's like if somebody just tells them it's going to
Sure.
take 6 years, but on
Sure.
February 12th, you're gonna, whatever.
Yes.
You're like, all
Yes.
right, I can get through this. It's not
Yes.
knowing what might work or if it's
Right.
going to stay, if it does work, or if it's going to, like whatever. And so I think that put me in such a state of fear the whole
Mm,
time. And then I bled all through my pregnancy. I had a hematoma. I mean, it was like one thing after another, really. And
mm,
so even through my pregnancy, I was still terrified.
sure.
So I see pictures and I go, is that really, was that, so I think it
Right.
is a strange experience.
Wow. Wow. Okay. So and I appreciate you sharing all of that because I think it just gives us like it's a unique experience when it's documented. Obviously everybody's experience is different. That piece of it I think makes it a little bit,
Yeah.
curious to me. When you're thinking I want to talk about embryo donation in general. First and foremost, I'm curious to know what's legal. So let's start with the legal component of embryo donation. Um, what belongs to you are you allowed to do with as you please? Is there some level of other considerations? Like, talk to me about what goes into either receiving an embryo or donating an embryo. Um, what is the terminology actually that you're also using as the person who is the donor recipient? Is there another? We talk about it as embryo donation.
Mhm.
Is the recipient have a different terminology? Like, what is the language you're using?
Yeah, recipient works well because you're receiving. I think, early history or language challenges around embryo donation really are connected to adoption. And legally, well, the word adoption is problematic for several reasons, personhood being a big one. And the idea of you can't, an embryo is considered property with special status. It's not quite considered a person, right? It has potential, but
Right,
it's not, an embryo is not a human, it's not a person. So you can't adopt
a
property.
non-human.
Right.
Okay,
So with Alabama, with all the kind of different things going on in the world, it's really the language becomes really important. The conceptualization that I understand people having is that if you're giving birth or you're raising a non-genetic child, what's the framework for that? So I think people lean on an adoption narrative as a way to just wrap their heads around non-genetic parenting in this specific way. But, and I will kind of start by saying I'm not an attorney. I'm not a lawyer. We have actually a wonderful attorney that's our legal advisor. So I'm speaking more as a layperson. And I will also say there's some state specifics around embryos. Louisiana has some specific laws. I mean, Alabama now, right? So like there are different things happening in this country that may impact your ability to donate embryos or receive embryos, kind of depending on what state. So I always recommend, if people are exploring this, to consult with an attorney in your specific state. And at Empower, we have a list of referrals, and we're happy to help people figure out how to navigate that.
Because
But the
because it would also mean, I mean, there would be some legal issues even just like transferring embryos across state lines, correct? Like the laws of one state might reflect differently in the laws of the next.
There could be, but that's why when we have our matches, we have we have each side essentially
Okay.
have an attorney who's licensed in their state to support their process. It really hasn't been that problematic. We honestly, we haven't worked with Louisiana or Alabama,
Right,
so
right,
we're
right.
just not like in some of those states right now. But for the most part, shipping is still fine, and all of that. So
Okay.
legal contracts are really important. I do see some agency, like embryo donation agencies or places selling legal contracts, online. I would absolutely not recommend
Ooh,
that.
yeah,
But
no.
in terms of who is able to donate, for the most part, anyone can donate their embryos. Obviously, there are certain standards for accepting embryos into different programs, depending on what quality and, what your embryos look like essentially. But in terms of legally, if they are your gametes, if it's you and your partners, let's say egg and sperm, these embryos belong to you, and you can generally choose a disposition option for them that includes donating to someone else. I have seen sometimes now clinics are maybe not providing that as an option because sometimes they don't want to manage that. So again, state specific, but also clinic specific. However, they're your embryos, you could send them to a storage facility and then you can donate them in that way. So
As you
sometimes
choose.
clinics have
Hmm.
some policies. If you worked with an egg donor or sperm donor to create the embryos initially, there's an added layer of just checking to make sure you have consent to redonate. So oftentimes in the legal contract between an egg donor and the intended parents, or between a sperm bank, there's a contract or a consent form, and those can be reviewed by an attorney to make sure that you have consent to redonate. We work with a lot of people who've worked with an egg or sperm donor to create embryos, and it's generally fine. I think we've had one situation where we had to go back to get consent from the egg donor, and that's all doable. So, most people can. It's more there are well over 1 million embryos cryopreserved around this country. And, and why is that? Because people create more embryos than they need often, and then they get paralyzed with this is a good problem to have on the front end. On the back end, you pay for storage for data suggests about 5 years, and then you go, my family feels complete. What should I do here? And I think it can be a big dilemma for people figuring out what to do. And so embryo donation is an option. It's one option of several other disposition options. You can, keep storing them. You can discard them. You can donate them to research and science or science. Generally, it's research at the clinic, or you can donate them to somebody else. So these are four very different options. Oftentimes we hear none of them sound very appealing to people who
Right,
have remaining
right,
embryos, right?
right, right.
So, what starts out as a good problem to have sometimes can become really challenging for people, especially with PGT testing being giving so much more information. So some people learn the sex of the embryos or the percentage chance they have to become a person, and they have their own children. All of a sudden, the idea of like we have these embryos or just cells becomes something really different, and so
Absolutely.
connection becomes different. But we try to help people make meaning of that and to make an informed decision through education and support so that you can decide, well, what does it mean to donate to somebody else? A lot of people don't know that they can't choose their recipients or match or meet their recipients. A lot of people think, oh, if I donate them, I have to give them to my clinic, and that's it. Then I never know if there are genetic children out there, and so
Right.
it's sort of a strange concept in this day and age that things still exist like that, but they do.
So when you think, I'm thinking, when I think one of the things that sticks for me the most when talking about embryo donation is this idea that a full genetic sibling would exist in somebody else's family, right? That's the thing that it's like, that's a bit hard to wrap my head around as a parent. Like that idea that this is an embryo created by my husband's sperm, my egg becomes somebody else's child. I want to hear a little bit more about the process that you hear from parents as they choose to donate. Let's start with that point. They have these leftover embryos, they feel their family is complete. What is some of the what is the philosophy or the perspective that they're experiencing in their head? Like how do they either make sense of it or come to terms with it? What is that emotional and I guess a bit cognitive, a bit intellectual, a little bit emotional process for them?
Yeah, that's such a perfect question. And it's complicated. Like I'm not an embryo donor myself, but my partners are, and we've talked about this at length, and I meet a lot of donors. And what I hear often, I hear several things. Sometimes I hear people who just really struggle to create these embryos. And the idea that they could help somebody else who's in a similar struggle really gives their own journey more meaning in a way. Um, and can feel really amazing for people that they can pay it forward, or I mean, people come to embryo donation as donors for different reasons. Some people have religious reasons, some people have moral reasons, some people feel I know my partner Jen, she had twins through IVF and then donated. She had only one remaining embryo, which is kind of its own thing, right? She
Hmm.
have one more child, or there's different complexities in that. But I don't want to speak exactly for her, but I believe she really felt it was really hard. She had miscarriages, she had loss, she had beautiful, healthy children from this batch of embryos, and there was this one other embryo there that she wasn't going to try for. And so she really connected to the idea of, can I help somebody else? And that gave her journey to those embryos a different meaning. And so she donated to a single woman who lived across the country from her, and now has a son, and they have an open relationship. And because I think the other piece for a lot of donors is, I would love to share in this way. I would love to support somebody else's family building, but I don't want to have no connection. Um, but how will I feel if I meet this child, or
Sure.
if they look like me or my children, or whatever else? And so it's really important that embryo donors can conceptualize their genetics, the siblings to their, genetic siblings to their children being raised in different homes with different families,
Mhm.
and to feel a sense of comfort through that. So there is a piece of letting go that becomes important.
Do you think
Um,
that they're saying, do you feel like there's a part of, I think some, because we talk about how language is so important, like, are you hearing these individuals, the people who have created the embryos, first of all, are they identified as the parents of the embryo or probably not?
Yep. We say donors.
Donors. Okay.
Yeah, sometimes genetic contributors is a
Interesting.
term that comes up.
Okay.
My partner Jen, like she knows the child born through her embryo. She doesn't think of him as his
Well, that was my
genetic
question.
mother or something.
Right.
She
Well,
does,
and that's my question. Do they think of that person as their child? Does that embryo ever become anything other than a genetic contribution, right? A genetic contribute, like contributing genetics? Or is there a part of them saying, yes, this is my child that I chose to offer to another family to raise and create and nurture and love, etc.?
yeah.
Like,
I mean, I think it's different than adoption in that way, right? They're not birth parents. They didn't grow this
right.
child and give birth to this child and stuff. Um, I think, and this is also why all of our matches and why it's ASRM recommended, that people go through mental health counseling prior to an embryo donation arrangement being completed. So part
Right.
of our process, obviously you have legal, you have genetic counseling, but you also have mental health, where both parties have sessions with a therapist, and then they do a joint. And part of the work in that is, how are you conceptualizing this? What if
Yes.
this person has different parenting styles than you do? What if, and so what we see most of the time, and that I think is the um, healthiest in a way to conceptualize is we hear donors who say, this is not my child. This, so I'm not, this is their choice, how they want to match with somebody who maybe shares similar values. And this comes up in our facilitated match meeting. It can be on a profile. People can ask, how would you discipline, or how, people can
Mm,
talk about these things, but it's not their place to make any decisions or something
sure.
like that. And people have to
Sure.
really feel comfortable with that. So,
Right.
that's why we have people do mental health. If the therapist says, oh, these, the donors really see this as their child and they're not going to be able to let go and they want, this, that, and the other, that could be challenging for the match down the line. And so, that's why these sessions are really important.
And I would say that with these, ongoing discussions, one of the things that I think about also is you may say, yes, I'm happy to, stay in touch and have an open relationship, but there's really no enforcing that in the long run.
And I
Right.
think that's one of the bigger fears that a
Yeah.
lot of donors have, is that somebody might just want my embryos and then run off. And yes, there's a legal contract, but the enforcement is a problem, right? And so
Right.
it's a little bit of a leap of faith and trust. And that's why we really encourage people to get to know each other. Make your decision based on how you feel about people. We do have our recipients do a background check, which I think helps people feel a little bit more comfortable. But for the most part, everybody's taking a leap of faith, right? And
Totally.
so,
Right.
but I think that donors who come to the table with some flexibility, with an understanding that, yes, I contributed to whoever this child is going to be, and I'll be there for them
Hmm.
in whatever way might feel appropriate, but I'm not their parent.
Okay.
That's kind of an important conceptualization. They don't want the responsibility of also, being
Right. Right.
um, for children, it could be different. Sometimes children, they might have a relationship more like cousins, but they're genetic siblings, right? And so really thinking about language and what makes sense and how to talk to kids about it, that's a big focus of what we do. I don't know that there's like a right exact way. It's more, let's talk about how we want to refer to each other and what does this mean? And it's a really unique way that families can be connected to each other.
And do we know anything in terms of research? Obviously, some of this, the science of this is not particularly new, but the explosion of it, I would say, is definitely newer. The ability to do this more frequently and more commonly. Do we know what is the data that we have, is if out there, about how these genetic siblings either feel about each other or feel about being, being a product of donation? What do we know at this point?
For embryo donation, really not much.
Yes. Okay.
There's some early research, but it's more from the um, experience of the parents of the either people who are receiving or people who are considering donating, and what are the factors that are involved in why people donate or don't, and that kind of stuff. There's really not a lot on children.
Right.
And, but I think if you stay grounded in the best practices and understanding the needs of donor conceived people in general, there's a lot to be learned about that.
Right.
Just the desire to connect, the curiosity about genetics, all those things are very valid and
Right.
important. And, that's why a directed model like that we have allows for that consensual way to connect into the future. Matches you don't have to be best friends you don't have to all go to Disneyland together just because you have an open donation. It just means that you're open to how this evolves over time, and you're understanding that the needs of children may shift, and that there's potentially a child that doesn't exist yet who is not part of the arrangement or the agreement or anything, that
True.
may have some feelings that need to be incorporated. So it's really kind of getting an understanding of that, so that you can create the foundation of an open dialogue so that you
Hmm.
can go through this together. But I think the donor conceived communities share feelings and thoughts that can translate. um
It's
you know
interesting. It'll be interesting to see over time, like what that
yeah,
looks like,
yeah, yeah.
I want to address this concept of anonymity, right? Historically, many, many years ago, when we were talking about sperm donation. It was always about it was all about anonymity. It was all about like, well, you're a struggling medical student, you'll donate your sperm and you never really think about it again because you were promised nobody will ever know. And a lot has changed with things like 23andMe, right? That idea of like I swab my cheek, and next thing I know that I'm not related to my parents, right? Like there's a lot of things that have come out of these stories,
Just
a lot of good
exploded the world.
information. Oh, exactly. I was actually just watching today a clip. I happened to have seen there where there was a totally unrelated to what we're talking about, but sort of, where there was a Holocaust survivor, a 97-year-old Holocaust survivor who just found out he knew that he had been taken in by parents, but that he didn't know his family. And he found out through genetic matching, he found family. And
Wow.
he's so many years later, and I might be wrong with this 97. I think my year is wrong, my age is wrong, but he was quite elderly, obviously. He was a child who survived the Holocaust. And through this 23andMe idea, through genetic matching, not only did he find out he was 99% Jewish, which he wasn't confirmed, he didn't know for sure that he was a Jew, but also actually found cousins that he had no idea had survived the war. So this idea of genetic, there's a lot of magnificent things that are coming out of genetics and genetic information. This space of anonymity versus, full consent and knowledge, whatever, we've changed our language, right? Those of us in reproductive mental health, we are very clear that there's no such thing as being an anonymous donor. Could we talk a little bit about what you've seen in the shift in language or in the shift of the construct of these experiences now that we know there's no such thing as anonymous? So if somebody came to you and said, I'm willing to donate, but I really don't want to have I don't want it to be an anonymous donation. Here's my biological information, my medical history. What are the realities that we are talking to these individuals about?
Yeah. Well, obviously anonymity doesn't exist and we have changed our language. What I think is really challenging is that a lot of clinics have not changed their practices. So you can say, oh, people can find each other and but if you operate as anonymous, you're continuing to create back-end challenges for these families who, so there's more open ID. What does that mean? When a child turns 18, they can attempt to contact somebody through a bank. Like the mechanisms for it are challenging. But directed donation continues to scare people a little bit. And for the clinics, it's more work,
Hmm.
honestly, right? You're navigating relationships. There's just more involved in that. The problem with anonymous embryo donation is you are talking about full genetic siblings, where a lot of times, let's say there's a cohort of 6 embryos, or I mean, we've seen a lot more also, right? Like if they're relinquished back to the clinic and the clinic's policy is that each family gets 1 embryo, which a lot of clinics have, then you are talking about full genetic siblings who are kind of treated as de-identified baby seeds at one clinic in the same geographical location that don't know each other.
Yeah.
This is problematic.
Yes.
I
Let's introduce the term consanguinity. Can we talk about that?
Well, and you hear stories like this and but it's also it's just not fair for people, but it's easier. It's much easier to just go, okay, you have brown hair, you have brown hair, you have, and like let's just do it like this. And I think the intention is to serve patients who are really at the end of their, you know, treatment line. And I was one of those patients. I appreciate, it helped me have a family. But on the back end, it's challenging for people because you can spit in a tube and find people that you're related to. But when there's not consent on the front end, when people aren't educated, where they don't fully understand what 23andMe is, then you get into this like, should I say something? Do I not? What does this mean? Anonymity doesn't exist. But if you're operating like that, that means that somebody could spit in a tube and find a genetic grandmother and they had no idea that their son was a sperm donor. And that could blow up families in different ways, right? And so there's just a lot of like tiptoeing and stuff like that. I think if we could be a little bit more transparent on the front end, if you are donating your gametes, your genetic material, you have to be prepared that humans might be on the other end of that. So, I think we're kind of at this place where we get it, that it's not possible, and we change the language. So it's non-directed, it's not anonymous, but the operations of it need to catch up a little bit. And it's more work for agencies and for banks and for clinics. And I know because we do this work, it's a lot of work. Like
It
I'm not,
is. Right.
but
Right.
it also establishes something very different for families. There's not a sense of secrecy. These are our donors. We have donor matches, embryo donation matches where the donors and the recipients, they meet each other.
Right.
And we had one match where they met for the first time. They lived across the country from each other, but the donor went to the other coast and ended up meeting the recipient on the day she found out that she was pregnant with their embryo.
Wow. Wow.
And it's beautiful, and they're all excited and happy for each other, right?
Right.
Does it bring up other feelings sometimes for donors and recipients? Yes, of course, and that's totally normal.
Hmm.
And can people sometimes feel jealous or conflicted? Yes, but these are the things that we normalize, that there's a range of emotions and that it's okay to have different feelings. We really try to help people understand and wrap their head around these things on the front end so that they're prepared in a way, but like you can't be fully prepared for an
Right.
experience you've never had,
Right,
right?
right. And I think also part of that is to acknowledge that there's so many parts of this that feel happy and joyful and hopeful and good. And then there's parts of this that we have to recognize that there is parts of this that are complicated, conflicting, emotional, and
Absolutely.
confusing.
Absolutely.
The thing that I mentioned the word consanguinity, which is for anybody who's not familiar with that term, is this idea of accidentally marrying somebody who is a genetic match or an immediate family member. And I think where this shows up for me the most in terms of my greatest concern is that the idea of using a Jewish egg bank. So for somebody who may not be familiar, there are agencies out there that are specifically focused on only Jewish donors, female Jewish donors. And I'm not particularly familiar with male sperm donor banks at all, but primarily egg donor. And that means that the pool just shrunk significantly, right? Who's going to care about using a Jewish egg donor? Most likely somebody who's more of the religious, of the religious, I don't even know the terminology, more religious. Okay. And then you've just narrowed down all of those people who will likely marry other religious people there is significant risk if we don't tell our children that they are egg donor conceived. And I think that this is something where there's a serious conundrum in the Orthodox world, in particular in the Jewish world, of the idea of like, well, why would I ever have to tell my children? They'll never have to know. Or if I tell my children, what if they tell their friends on the playground and then I will be ostracized from the community because that is just such a strange thing in a religious society to share. And yet what are we left what is the alternative to that, right? And so this idea of like they'll never need to know, so therefore I won't tell them, but with almost like a closing of the eyes to yes, but when they're 19 they also can swab their cheek or spit in a tube and find out that they are genetically related differently to you than they knew, and the devastation that that can draw. So I don't know if you want to speak to it or comment on that, but obviously this is something that comes up for me quite a bit. I do the counseling, as I've been trained to do, and part of that, that counseling consultation includes things about disclosure. And very often, and it's not only, by the way, the Jewish religious community. I heard it from Nigerian couples and from Southeast Asian couples who are like, we are not telling anybody because of lineage or because of concern for my family or my grandmother might not accept this child as their own. And those are real concerns. And so I do my job about informing and exploring, etc. But very often I'll leave with this feeling of like, did I do enough? Was I clear enough? And understanding can't necessarily take the full responsibility, but it really does worry me.
Yeah, and it's hard because there are real legitimate cultural considerations
Yeah.
for this, and I understand that and I respect that. And the best practices, as you know, for donor conceived children is to be honest. And the disruption of late term disclosure, like when somebody finds out much later in their life, it it could be very traumatic for people. And understandably, if they've been essentially not told the truth and lied to for their whole life, and then they find out from somebody outside their family or from a kit that they spin. I mean, we just don't know if every seventh grader is going to be doing DNA testing at some point, and so it's the best that we can do as therapists, I think, is counsel and provide the information. We can't parent for people, and that's not our job, and I don't think we want to at
No,
all.
thank you. You can all keep your own kids.
Right. But
Right.
but I think anonymity, there's a strong connection to shame. And I think different cultures have different just frameworks for that, or I don't even know the right word necessarily, but in different cultures, there are different types of shame or different ways that people can feel shamed for having reproductive challenges or for needing to work with a donor of some sort. But shame and secrecy, like these things don't bode well for families. So being able to move through a sense of shame into a place of confidence, into a place of feeling proud, into a place of just really making conscious decisions about how to disclose or what to disclose or how to work within your cultural community and framework to share truths with children and to really value that in a specific way. It's complicated. Like it is very, I feel very fortunate. I mean, my story was on Netflix for 2 years, as was,
Exactly.
shots of me crying with no pants on. Like, so I am very open and, so but I do work with people who, a lot Asian communities as well. You mentioned some different communities, but there is a deep sense of shame or just that it's not going to be understood. And, how can we work with that? And, I think everybody's got to make their own decisions at the end of the day, but it is
Yeah.
challenging.
Wow. Where do you see Empower with Moxie in a few years' time? What do you hope it looks like?
Oh my gosh, it has been such a whirlwind. We kind of started this, I guess it's a business. It was like an accident, really in some ways that we just want to make this landscape better for people. We just want people to be able to make decisions for their embryos in the way that they see fit. And for people to be able to create a family in a connected way and that they know, who their child's embryo started with, and it's been really, really satisfying. And I think, I hope that it just grows. And honestly, I hope we can change the landscape of embryo donation so that it feels a little bit more inclusive and more accessible for people. It's a more affordable family building option in a lot of ways. And you cannot pay for an embryo. It's a truly altruistic expression. It's in donating your embryos. But I also hope that we can make a dent at the clinics. And that's what I continue to see being one of the hardest pieces
Mm,
that, especially with really large clinics that have their policy, this is the way we do things. And it's like, this is the way you've done things for 30 years. Like, it's
time
time
to
to
grow up.
consider yeah,
Yeah.
it's time to consider 23andMe and anonymity is not a word to be changed. It is a construct and a
Mhm,
concept
mhm,
that
mhm.
needs to be adapted. And we have figured out how to adapt that in a way that makes it really easy for the client. We do all of the logistics and paperwork and documentation, and we can order FDA testing. I mean, we can do all of these things for people. It would just be really wonderful if clinics would be more open to change. I think
Wow.
that's kind of my like secret wish under the
I love it. Okay, I'll give you another year or two. You'll do it. You'll pull it off.
Oh my
I
God, if
do
my
want to
hair
just
doesn't go completely
yeah,
gray
no,
in the
it looks good a
process.
little bit gray. I do want to ask you, I want to just go back to that one comment before we wrap up. You
Yeah,
just talked about reimbursement or payment. So one of the things that's very interesting is that you can be paid for sperm donation. You could be paid for egg donation. You get quite a significant amount of money for egg donor to be becoming an egg donor. But yet with embryo donation, there is no money allowed to change hands. Why is it different?
that's a question that's better answered by our attorney. I mean, I the potential that an embryo has to be a child might have something to do with it. It's kind of, and I don't know honestly that it's illegal. It is in some states. It's more an ethics
Really?
issue, I believe. That there's
Okay.
some, that I don't know, there's ethics in all of this when you think about buying somebody's eggs or, whatever. So we say donation, but the idea of buying embryos, I don't know the origin of the reason why. I just know that you don't, it's not compensated.
Right.
Like
And you
it's
are allowed to have, like, you're allowed to get reimbursed for certain expenses, correct?
storage. Sometimes people ask for like that, like, oh, I've been storing embryos for 5 years and I'm requesting back pay up to 1 year. It generally isn't much more than that.
Okay.
Embryo donors don't pay for any of the process that they go through. They still have to put in the time, obviously, but like they don't pay for their attorney fees. Generally, the recipients cover the cost of all of those
That makes
ancillary
sense.
stuff like that. Yeah, there's not really, other than storage, there really aren't. I mean, I guess certain programs might have some kind of recuperation fees or
Right,
like
right,
something, but
right,
you're really going into embryo donation with the concept of I want to help somebody. Some people feel like I'd like to give these embryos a chance. Some people feel like I have the most amazing children and there are three more embryos from the same cohort and they could be, in this world or, however
right.
they conceptualize it. But it truly is more of an altruistic
So
experience.
interesting. Okay, so let's wrap it up today with some misconceptions. What are some misconceptions you want people to know are not true?
Well, I guess maybe I'll start with the misconception specifically to embryo donation. Early history of embryo donation was a bit pro-life in theme, save the unborn babies kind of vibe, and quite Christian, quite religious in that way. And um, I think a big misconception around that is that that's how all embryo donation is. It is not true. And part of that narrative that we at Empower are really trying to change, but part of that narrative has excluded single people and the LGBTQ community. And
Mhm.
so we have a lot of matches that are both with single people and with people in the LGBTQ community. And so I think that's a real misconception. I hear people say, oh, but I'm gay. I can't donate my embryos. You're like, what? No, you
Mhm.
had a young egg donor. Your embryos are probably great quality, right? And
Right,
so
right.
so I think that's a huge misconception. It's also a misconception that you can't know where your embryos go. Like right now we have some lovely donors, we just got new donors that are looking for a Jewish family specific. They're a Jewish family, they have a tested embryo, they
Wow.
want to connect in that way. And, we have other people who are looking for other specific connection points and things like that. And so I think it really, people should know that, I mean, I'm wearing my embryo
Love it.
shirt,
Was it
right?
your
Your
embryo, your
embryos,
family,
your
your
family,
choice?
your choice. That's kind of our motto. And so I don't mean to be like putting my, not that there's much excitement, but, um,
For all of you who are only listening, we
I
were just
mean,
flashed by Maya. No.
but yeah, your embryo is your family, your choice. I think that's a misconception with embryo donation is that you have to go on a wait list at a clinic and be given whatever you're given and you don't have choices, both as donor and recipient. And I think it's really important for people to know that you have a lot of choices when it comes to your family building and with embryo donation. So
Beautiful.
um, yeah.
That's amazing. Thank you. Oh
Thank
gosh,
you
Maya, there's
for-
so many. It's so
We can just chat
fascinating.
all day. I mean,
We could just
between the
talk.
two
Yeah,
of us,
I
yakking
know.
away.
I think this is such a fascinating kind of it's something that I think many people never even considered. And I think especially, I think especially in the post fertility. So you've had this whole journey to become pregnant, you create these embryos. And I do think that a lot of people just end up being completely stuck in that space of like, I don't even know what to do with them. And my understanding was also that like this idea of like donating to science, I feel like last year at the conference, they said there is nowhere to donate them. Like, just by the way,
Yeah,
yeah, you could, but wink, wink, nod, nod. They're not
I
going
know.
anywhere.
It's just the disposition for, and they also, it's like if you've gone through IVF, you get a form in the beginning of your journey that says, what do you want to do if you make embryos at the end, right? And you have to designate. And it's like, how do you check a box that says donate to somebody else? That doesn't even,
Correct.
like, I don't even know if I have embryos and I'm going to check this box. Then you
Right.
have donate to science. What does that mean? It generally means lab research
Right.
or, people practicing biopsying or something like that. Because science does, I mean, there was a science I had written down on a post-it that has now, I'm looking at it, it's completely faded because they had, a Stanford, UC San Diego, there were a couple places, but then especially after Alabama, I think some of these places were not accepting embryos anymore.
Correct.
I think there's a fantasy that some people, or just like a misconception, that if I donate to science or research, it goes to stem cell or cancer. So, and it's not
Doesn't.
exactly set up like that. So,
Right.
I don't think that, I think that we are leaving people who are, former fertility patients who've struggled, who've gone through a real challenge in their own life. We're leaving them with another challenge
Right.
of, this is my continued umbilical cord to the clinic and to my fertility experience. And,
Sure.
you can keep paying a storage bill, but some of these storage fees have gone, I mean, I'm hearing $1,200 a year.
Yeah.
I'm hearing, and so to pay that kind of money when you know your family, or you feel fairly certain your family is complete, like it can add up over time. I mean, we
Absolutely.
have people reach out 27, 28 years later, go, I still have embryos. I'm working on my will. Do I
Oh,
leave this to
wow.
my
Right.
children? Right? And you're
Right.
just,
Right.
oh my God, but
And
we're
then
gonna,
some people do. Like
I
they
know,
literally just do because they're like, I can't deal with it. I'll let my
right.
kids deal with it. But it
And
is
then can you
property.
imagine? Then you have your
Yes.
own sibling on cryopreservation. Like it's this
Oh,
kind of, we're really creating a dilemma for people that there's not a lot of resolution. So our goal is to provide a resolution through embryo donation, but also we're non-directive. We're not pro-life in this. It's not, that's not our vibe. Our vibe is make a disposition choice that feels right for you, but you have to educate yourself and you have to learn what that is. And eventually you're going to have to make a decision that could be challenging for you. So,
right. Right.
you know, I,
Oh. I also find it very interesting that of those hundreds of thousands of embryos that you describe being on ice, many of them are no longer, no one's paying for them anymore. And my understanding is that they still can't dispose of them. The clinics can't say, we're just going to dispose of these. It's just fascinating, the laws and the complexity around them. And
it's
you can
really,
get them, but you have to pay for the back pay. But they can't just like get rid of them because nobody's paid the
yeah.
fee, you
Well,
know?
I mean, I guess legally they can, but somebody said to me once, I don't want to be the doctor on the news who threw out all the embryos.
Exactly.
But
Exactly.
yeah, but about 25% of embryos, according to, some early research or studies done, 25%, 25% get abandoned. So
Right.
people just stop paying. So then what you've got,
Exactly.
and who's on the hook for that? And now, especially with all this stuff coming out of the Alabama ruling, like it's just bringing a lot of this to light. So, I think we have to find more solutions for the
Yep.
clinics. The clinics are trying
Absolutely.
to do their job. They're trying to help people have families. And so that, that it's a lot to take on, but there is some adjustment that needs to be done in terms of embryo disposition and pathways.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, for anybody who's not familiar, just take a look, do some Googling around Alabama and the personhood component of embryos in Alabama, how it kind of shut down completely. Most of the IVF clinics were like, we're out, we're not dealing with this right now. I've heard a few have opened, but major concern that, and there is a question of whether these laws will kind of make their way into other states as well. No, we're not going to go further into that right now, but if you're interested, that's what you should be researching. Maya, thank you so much for spending some time with me. I so appreciate it.
It's really fun to see you.
Eh,
And yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely.